At my wife's funeral, the gravedigger pulled me aside. "Sir, your wife paid me to bury an empty coffin. I thought he was crazy. Stop joking." He secretly slipped an old brass key into my hand and whispered, "Don't go home. Go to Unit 24 right now." What I discovered inside Unit 24 stopped me. Cold rooted me to the spot like I'd forgotten how to breathe. And in that moment, with everything I thought I knew crumbling around me, I understood one thing clearly: I had to find a way to pull my own life back from the edge before there was nothing left to save. Welcome to Alphadadstories, a place where the stories that matter most, the ones about family loyalty and what we carry in silence, finally get told. Before we begin, if these stories reach something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd follow along and leave a like. It helps more people find their way here. I'd also love to know from what you've heard so far. Whose side of this family's pain do you find yourself feeling most deeply? Conrad's, Neva's, or Petra's? Drop your answer below. A quick note before we go further: some elements of this story have been shaped for the listening experience, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters. One quick note: this is a fictional story, and certain details have been dramatized to serve the narrative. The gravedigger's hand clamped onto my bicep like a rusted vice at the exact moment I turned to walk away from my wife's grave for the last time. A rough, sudden intrusion, the kind that violates the sacred quiet of a burial ground. My name is Conrad Halford. 68 years old, long retired from a career inspecting bridges, a man who built his whole identity around reading stress and holding steady. Yet right then, something deep inside me was giving way. I'd been standing alone watching red North Carolina clay fall in heavy loads onto the walnut casket that was supposed to hold Neva, my wife, my partner of 40 years. The Charlotte afternoon pressed down like a wet wool blanket, thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the cold bite of turned earth. Each shovelful landed with a thud. I felt in my back teeth a percussion line marking the collapse of everything I thought I'd built. The mourners had drifted off toward the waiting cars. It was just me, that red mound, and the man whose fingers wouldn't release my arm. Silas Prudhomme, 58, a groundskeeper who'd spent enough years under the North Carolina sun that his face had the texture of old saddle leather, cut me off just as the last of the crowd dispersed. His gaze kept jumping to where my daughter Petra and her husband Declan were retreating across the grass. When he closed the distance between us, he brought with him the sharp reek of stale pipe smoke and damp subterranean earth. He yanked me off the path. "Sir, do not walk away." He rasped, the sound of it like something dry dragged across stone. "Not yet. I have a contract. 20 years in the waiting. Have you ever had solid ground turn liquid under your feet while your body refused to move?" I searched his face for some sign of delusion, anything that would let me dismiss him. But what stared back at me was the unsettling calm of a man who'd been waiting a very long time to fulfill an obligation. The humid air locked in my chest like concrete. My whole professional life had been spent locating hidden damage, hairline cracks, concealed corrosion, the lie a structure tells before it fails. But I couldn't build a rational framework around why this man was standing at Neva's grave, invoking a contract that predated half my daughter's life. I tried pulling free, but Prudhomme held with a grip that had nothing to do with his age. He dug into the pocket of his overalls and produced something small. "Sir, your wife paid me a very large sum of money a long time ago for a specific service." His breath was warm against my ear as he said it. She had been precise about when it was to happen. Empty. That single word detonated somewhere behind my sternum before he'd even gotten to it. He folded a small, cold brass key into my palm and pressed until the metal edge cut into my skin. Stamped on it the number 24. I opened my mouth to demand answers to call Declan back, but Prudhomme's face suddenly shifted into raw, concentrated alarm. He dropped my arm and moved fast, sliding into the shadow of a granite mausoleum nearby, until the darkness took him whole. "Sir, that box is empty," he hissed back at me as he went. "Your wife paid me to bury air." I didn't move. The humid breeze that moments ago had felt suffocating now ran cold along the back of my neck. I stared at the key pressing into my flesh, then at the mound of freshly turned dirt that was supposed to mark the end of Neva's story, and the realization arrived like a structural collapse, slow then total. My life was built on a lie. A broad, warm hand dropped onto my shoulder and nearly sent that brass key tumbling into the mud. My whole body jerked. I clamped my fist around the metal and drove it to the bottom of my trouser pocket. It sat against my thigh like something live a secret, with weight and heat. Declan Veach, 34 mergers and acquisitions, always the sharpest dressed man in any room, stood beside me wearing an expression of grief that was disturbingly convincing. The expensive cedar and leather cologne he favored cut through the scent of wet red clay and wilting lilies. "Conrad," he said, pitching his voice to the low measured register of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. "You've been out here a long time. It's over now." He pressed my shoulder, the gesture of a comforter, but it landed like the click of a deadbolt. I studied the knife-sharp crease of his slate-gray suit, then moved my eyes to his face. I'd spent years counting this man as a blessing, solid, driven, exactly what a father hopes for. Now, with Prudhomme's warning still reverberating, I was looking for the seam where the mask had been stitched on. His eyes glistened, but they didn't rest. They moved across the cemetery's edges in quick, methodical sweeps, the way you check exits, not mourners. "I'm here for you, Pop," he went on, reaching for the nickname that had always landed warmly, "always have been." A cold sweat crawled up the back of my neck. I knew that sensation. It was the same one I got standing on a bridge that looked structurally sound, but hummed wrong underfoot, a suspension cable presenting fine on the outside, while the interior wires snapped one by one. That's how bridges actually fall. Not in an instant. Quietly. Incrementally. Until there is nothing left holding anything up. The gravel shifted under Declan's heel as he repositioned himself, and I saw it clearly then he wasn't here to comfort me. He was posted at that grave like a sentry, making sure I moved along before a question could form in my mind and find its way to my lips. "We should get Petra to the car," he said, tilting his chin toward my daughter. Petra Halford, 29. A pediatric cardiologist whose precision in an operating theater was something I'd always marveled at, stood apart from the dispersing crowd, pressing a damp tissue against her mouth. She looked like something breakable. "She's having a hard time," Declan murmured. "Best to get her inside. Something off about you right now, Conrad. The way you're looking at me." I manufactured a smile. It cost me. "I just want a minute with her. Alone." "I'll be right behind you," I said. A beat of hesitation, his eyes tightened just briefly, and then the bereaved son-in-law persona settled back over his features like a shade being drawn. How many dinners had I sat across from him, refilling his glass, never once suspecting he was already appraising everything within reach. "Don't take too long," Declan said, his tone as smooth as poured oil. "That house echoes now." I watched him move away. The SUV door closed with a heavy, muffled thud that rolled through the silent cemetery, like a period at the end of a sentence. As Declan steered Petra across the grass, the hand at the small of her back no longer read as tenderness. It read as custody. I stayed at the empty grave, the brass key throwing off heat in my pocket, knowing that whatever road led home was not one I could travel yet. I needed the road that led to the truth. The Charlotte afternoon had gone quiet by the time I threw myself into the truck cab, hit the locks, and sat there, with my heart battering my ribs. My hands trembled badly enough that I gripped the wheel with both fists for a solid minute, staring at the shimmering asphalt where Declan's SUV had turned and vanished. The fear had a taste sharp and metallic coating my tongue. It tangled with the suspicion that had taken root that the man I'd called son for years was something else entirely. I fished the brass key from my pocket, turned it in my fingers, its coldness strange against the stale heat baking inside the cab. I was reaching for the water-stained envelope Prudhomme had passed me when my phone buzzed hard in the cup holder. A text from Petra. "Dad, come home alone. Need to talk. Just you." The screen's blue light threw itself across the windshield like a flare. 31 years, that's how long she'd been my daughter, and in all that time she had never once written that word. Dad. To Petra, I was always Daddy or Papa, right up through medical school and board certifications, and the years of repairing small, failing hearts. That flat clinical syllable was a fracture running straight through everything I thought I knew about her. This wasn't my child reaching out to her father. It was bait a line cast by whoever was standing over her shoulder. Declan was setting a hook. I was meant to be the catch. A man's world, let me tell you, does not comes apart with any kind of drama. It comes apart with 3 letters lit up on a phone screen. My blood went cold as I sat with the full weight of what that message meant. If he held her phone, he held her. I tore the envelope open. The smell that rose from it, old paper, sealed years, things long kept hidden, flooded the hot cab around me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dense with Neva's elegant, sloping handwriting. Seeing her script was like hearing a voice from across a canyon. "Conrad, if you are reading this, then my death was the only move left on the board." It began. The ink seemed to pulse under my thumb. The letter was a confession and a warning. Neva had spent months investigating Declan, uncovering that he was a high-level mole for the Covenant, a criminal empire she believed she'd dismantled decades earlier, back when she was still running operations for the Bureau. She had staged her own death, engineering the heart attack and the empty burial to flush the wolves into the open and keep me out of the line of fire. "The enemy isn't at the gate," she wrote. "He is sitting at our dinner table." She wasn't in that grave. She was waiting for me. The letter closed with a single set of coordinates. Interstate 85, Storage Complex, Unit 24. I read those lines 3 times, my vision swimming. Every instinct I'd sharpened across a career spent finding hidden damage told me that the family home had become a structural trap, a site poised for catastrophic failure. Going back to the suburbs wasn't an option. I had to follow where the key led. I shoved the truck into gear, the engine tearing through the graveyard quiet behind me. My eyes burned rage and a wild, desperate hope, fighting for the same space, knowing that every mile I put between myself and that cemetery left my daughter alone in a house with a predator. I pulled out of Magnolia Hill Cemetery and drove toward the only solid thing left in my world. The rhythmic thud of tires crossing expansion joints on Interstate 85 beat against the soles of my feet like a slow, industrial pulse. Memories work the way stress fractures do. The damage is invisible until the bridge begins to scream under a load it can no longer carry. I held the steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip while the dashboard's weak glow threw long, unsteady shadows across my face. My rage at Declan sat in my gut like a cold iron weight, but beneath it, something older and deeper was beginning to give way. My mind, hunting for something to hold on to, slipped back to a rain-soaked night in the spring of 1995. I could almost smell the rain sheeting against the kitchen window of our old house, that clean electric smell that always felt like the world wiping itself clean. Neva was at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the steam rising and dissolving in a thin, forgotten thread. Her hands were trembling, a tremor I had never once seen in the woman who used to spend whole afternoons at the university library, calmly cataloging rare manuscripts. "Conrad," she had said, her voice barely rising above the sound of rain on glass. "I didn't spend my days cataloging books. I spent them cataloging monsters." The admission had hit me like a structural failure, sudden, total. My quiet book-loving wife was an FBI undercover specialist, the primary architect behind the destruction of a billion-dollar criminal empire called the Covenant. "It's over now," she had promised, fixing me with an intensity that made the room feel small. "The Covenant is dismantled. We're safe." I had been so ready to believe her. I had built everything I loved on what I took to be solid ground, never questioning whether the concrete went all the way down. That night in the kitchen in 1995, Neva walked me through the $1.2 billion empire she'd helped destroy and the decision she'd made to leave the bureau and protect our infant daughter Petra. "I'm choosing us, Conrad," she'd said, her voice finally finding its footing. "I'm choosing Petra. They think I'm just a witness. They'll forget my name inside a year." The relief that washed through me then was warm and complete and embarrassingly naive. I took her at her word that she was vanishing into the background, scrubbing her professional history, clean, becoming only the mother Petra deserved. For nearly 30 years, I lived inside that comfort, never suspecting it was nothing more than a temporary ceasefire in a war that had never actually ended. How do you look a woman in the eye for 30 years and never once see the steel behind the silk? The steering wheel trembled as I pushed harder toward Pineville, the past and the present bleeding together until the line between memory and asphalt disappeared. Every mile I covered revealed how thin my knowledge of her really was. She hadn't simply walked away from the FBI. The disappearance she'd performed had been so thorough, so practiced, it was a dry run for exactly what she'd just pulled off. The hum of tires on Interstate 85 snapped me back, a sound like a clock counting down, and I understood at last that Neva hadn't been running from the past. She'd been standing watch over it. That understanding settled on me like cold water. I was a man crossing a bridge that had been quietly burning for 30 years, while I drove back and forth across it, oblivious. The gravel ground under my tires like crushed bone as I crossed a threshold I'd never be able to step back over. The massive rusted sign for the Interstate 85 storage complex appeared ahead, jutting out of the fading North Carolina light like a tombstone. I steered the truck into the desolate, wind-scoured lot, the brass key pressing cold and insistent against my thigh. The place was a sprawl of industrial decay, ozone, and wet metal on the air, high-voltage lines droning overhead like a disturbed hive. I had braced myself for an empty maze of locked doors. Instead, there was a man posted against a black sedan near the main gate. His posture had that particular quality, controlled, watchful, predatory, of someone accustomed to the margins. He was no storage clerk. "You're late, Mr. Halford," he said, his voice a low rasp that the wind nearly took. "I didn't realize I was on the schedule," I answered, stepping out and keeping my hand close to my pocket. Fletcher Aldrich, 52, an FBI special agent in charge with close-cropped iron-gray hair, waited at the gate of the Pineville storage facility, looking more like a seasoned contractor than a federal officer. He skipped the handshake. A badge appeared with a practiced flick, the kind issued to men who operate in the Bureau's black budget margins, the same world Neva's old stories had hinted at without ever fully illuminating. It was only then I grasped that this facility wasn't a repository for old furniture. It was a sanctioned FBI black site my wife had been running operations out of for months, right beneath my feet. A badge, a gun, a lie. It was Neva's trinity. Aldrich observed me with a clinical remove that put every one of my engineering instincts on alert. She said you'd be wearing the tie she gave you for your 30th anniversary. He noted, his eyes settling on my collar. She was right. A reluctant trust broke through the surface of my anger mixed with a breathless, agonizing anticipation. "Where is she, Aldrich?" I demanded, voice tight. "No more games." He didn't answer. He simply turned and moved into the rows of corrugated metal units, the dying sun blazing off the steel around him. "The Covenant has ears in places you haven't thought of yet, Conrad," he murmured, not looking back. "Keep your voice down and your eyes moving." Moving through those metal corridors felt like passing through the ribcage of some great creature that had swallowed my entire life and left nothing but bones. Aldrich explained the facility's federal contract for sensitive relocations, but the real shock arrived when he told me that Neva hadn't just reached out to them recently. She never truly left their payroll, he said, his boots striking a steady rhythm on the pavement. She's been a deep cover consultant for decades. The weight of that landed like something physical. While I'd been out measuring bridges and planning retirement, my wife had been running federal operations from our own zip code. Aldrich stopped in front of a door indistinguishable from 100 others. But when he gestured toward the padlock on Unit 24, I understood that the key in my pocket wasn't simply an entry to a room. It was the entry to a truth that would end the man I had been. My heart hammered in a frantic, ragged rhythm, dread and hope striking the same chord as I reached for the lock. The key seated itself with a click that rang through the silent corridor like a shot. The stillness of that hallway felt nothing like peace. It felt like the breath a man draws in the last moment before he steps off an edge. I stood there motionless before the corrugated steel door of Unit 24, fingers trembling around the brass. My mind, ordinarily occupied with the load-bearing capacity of reinforced concrete or the tension ratings of suspension cables, was struggling to absorb the monumental weight pressing in from behind a thin sheet of corrugated metal. Fletcher Aldrich stood watch with clinical detachment, his outline dark against the orange blaze of the setting sun at the corridor's far end. His hand hovered near his sidearm eyes, quartering the empty, shadow-drenched rows for any sign of a tail. The damp heat of the North Carolina evening had pooled in that narrow alleyway, layered with industrial grease and settled dust, so that every breath felt like something you had to earn. "My hands shouldn't be shaking like this," I said, more to myself than to him. "I've worked high-voltage lines in the middle of a hurricane without flinching." Aldrich kept his eyes on the perimeter. "Different kind of storm, Conrad. Just turn the key." I studied the brass key. The fine surface scratches the dull patina of something that had been lying in wait for this exact moment for years. A secret is like a load-bearing wall. You can't tear it out without bringing the roof down on your own head. Aldrich drew closer, voice dropping to a low, tight vibration. He told me the FBI had been spoofing the facility's own security grid for months, feeding looped footage back through the camera system to hide their presence. They were running a ghost operation inside a commercial storage lot invisible to the company whose name was on the gate. "How long has she been in there?" I asked, the metallic taste of fear reasserting itself on my tongue. "Long enough to miss you," Aldrich replied, "and long enough to understand exactly what finding her is going to cost both of you." He stepped aside, giving me the kind of solitary space a man needs when he is about to exhume his own life. "Have you ever gripped a piece of metal that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, That was the key in my hand. The sound of red clay hitting the walnut casket was still ringing in my ears from just hours before, and the savage irony of that whole performance turned my stomach. "Once you open this, Conrad, the librarian is gone forever," Aldrich warned. "I know," I said, my voice finally finding something solid to stand on. "She's been gone since the cemetery." I understood completely that the man I was standing at the threshold of becoming would have nothing in common with the man who'd driven away from Magnolia Hill Cemetery. But Aldrich's final admission added a new layer of cold to everything. He told me the Bureau wasn't simply sheltering Neva. They were running her, using her as the ultimate lure to pull the Covenant's highest-ranking shadow operatives into the light. My wife wasn't just a survivor. She was the bait at the center of a federal trap. The lock snapped open, a sharp final sound that split my past from my future. As my hand closed around the handle, I understood I was terrified of whoever might be standing on the other side. My breath seized in my chest as the tension crested. I heaved upward, ready to face whatever waited in the dark. The rolling door shrieked against its tracks, a tearing metallic cry that rang through the hollow facility like the sky splitting open. My lungs were burning. My pulse hammered at the side of my neck in a steady drumbeat, marking the 72 hours I had spent mourning a woman who might not be dead. What rose from behind that door wasn't dusty boxes or moth-eaten furniture. It was a fortress. This was no storage unit. It was a war room. 3 large monitors lined the left wall, each running live surveillance feeds. One showed the old textile warehouse near the Catawba Industrial District. Another displayed our neighborhood in real time. A third showed what appeared to be prison security footage stamped with timestamp codes I didn't recognize. A large tactical map of Charlotte dominated the right wall, bristling with red pins linked by string the Covenant's known locations, safe houses, and operational cells, spreading across the southeast like a disease. File boxes stamped FBI classified in bold red letters sat stacked beneath a metal desk. The air carried the sharp smell of burnt espresso and dry erase marker, the scent of someone who had been living and working in this space for weeks waiting. And then I saw her. A figure rose from behind the bank of monitors silhouetted by the blue-white glow of the screens. Neva Halford, 66, was known to our neighborhood as a retired librarian. Standing inside Unit 24, she carried the precise lethal posture of the undercover operative she had been 3 decades earlier. She stepped forward, her movements exact and stripped of the soft-shouldered ease I had spent years loving. Exhaustion had carved new lines into her face, but she was vibrantly, impossibly alive. "Conrado," she said, her voice a soft anchor thrown into the storm of my disorientation. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The 3 days I had spent drowning in grief collapsed into a single wave of raw, agonizing relief that nearly buckled my knees. "You're alive." I choked out the voice, barely sounding like mine. "I touched your hand in that casket. You were cold. She wasn't a ghost. She was a soldier." The woman in front of me wasn't the person who misplaced her reading glasses. She was a professional who had staged her own death with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster. My knees finally gave, and she moved with startling speed to catch me, steering me down into the cold plastic of a folding chair. She explained in a low, measured tone that the body at the viewing had been a cadaver prepared by a funeral director who owed the Bureau a debt from a previous chapter of his life. How do you grieve a woman for 72 hours, only to have her hand you a bottle of water and an apology? I looked at her and searched for the person I had shared a life with. What I found was a stranger wearing my wife's face. "The grief had to be real, Conrad," she said, eyes fixed on mine. For Declan to believe it, your heart had to actually break. He has been watching us for years. A surge of gratitude that she was alive hit me first, and was almost immediately shouldered aside by something dark and jagged. "You let me bury a stranger so he could watch me cry?" I said, my voice barely holding together. She had converted my grief into a tactical instrument, a piece of theater staged for the man sleeping under our roof. I looked at her and saw the cold steel of someone who had dismantled an empire. And for the first time I felt afraid of what she was about to tell me. She turned back to the monitors, fingers moving across the keyboard with a clipped, rhythmic precision that cut through the low drone of the warehouse fans. Neva didn't simply have a hiding place. She had built a shrine to our family's destruction, pinned to that corrugated wall with the methodical thoroughness of a forensic autopsy. I stood behind her as the blue light of the screens washed over us, both revealing a timeline that drained the warmth from my blood. It started in 2012, a year I remembered for Petra's 16th birthday and her first car. On the screen it was flagged as the year of acquisition. Neva pointed to a grainy surveillance photo our daughter at a college mixer years later, with Declan Veitch standing a few feet away, wearing an easy, calculated smile. "He didn't find her by accident, Conrad," Neva said, her voice empty of its usual warmth. "He was assigned to her. Every coincidental meeting, every shared interest, every song they supposedly fell in love with, together, all of it scripted by a man operating from a prison cell." A chilling horror settled deep in my bones as she laid it out. Declan had been handpicked by the Covenant's leader, the same man she had helped put away decades ago. 28 years ago, I testified against the Covenant. I worked undercover for 18 months posing as a bookkeeper for one of their front companies, a shipping firm in Wilmington. I saw everything. The wire transfers cycling through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, drug shipments buried inside legitimate cargo, the cold-blooded elimination of anyone who asked one question too many. When a 16-year-old dock worker named Dion stumbled onto a heroin shipment and was killed for it shot twice in the head and dumped in the river, I knew I had to come forward. Her testimony put 12 men behind bars, including the boss. But it also painted a target on our family that had never faded. They wanted me dead, Conrad. They still do. Declan was the ultimate instrument of proxy revenge, a man engineered to be our daughter's perfect match, so he could eventually destroy her from the inside. Lies are like termites. They hollow out the heart of your home while you're standing outside worrying about the paint on the shutters. I had spent 11 years believing I was a solid judge of character. Yet I had thrown open my front door to a sleeper agent and called him son. Neva laid out the conditioning Declan had undergone, raised from childhood, as a disciple shaped to be the ideal son-in-law, while his loyalty to the organization never wavered a degree. 11 years. 3 years of courtship, 8 years of marriage. Every whispered, "I love you," to Petra had been a scripted move on a board she didn't know she was sitting at. He's a ghost, Conrad, a man with no soul of his own. Only the mission his father handed him. 8 years of marriage, and not a single day of it was real. I looked at a digital photo from our wedding day, Declan, standing between Neva and me, his arm around Petra. He wasn't her husband. He was her hunter. In that flickering blue light, his wide grin read as a bared snarl. I thought of my years in bridge inspection. How a single corroded bolt buried deep in the structural webbing can bring down an entire span without a moment's warning. I had walked her down the aisle. I had laid her hand into the palm of a predator and felt nothing but pride at the man she had found. The stale air of the unit closed around me as the full weight of my failure compressed my lungs. The evidence photos on the screens seemed to cut straight into my eyes. I felt the nausea rise as Neva pulled up a second folder, her expression going hard as she murmured, And that isn't even the worst of it, Conrad. He has a life we never saw. I stared at the monitors, absorbing the reality that the man I had called my son was the most lethal kind of structural lie. Aldrich stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder labeled VH Secondary. He didn't offer words. He simply slid a glossy surveillance photograph across the metal desk, an image that sliced through my composure like a shard of broken glass. I looked down at the photo, and the steady hum of the safe house air purifier seemed to go silent entirely. The picture showed Declan Veach in a sunny driveway in Indianapolis, Indiana. No tailored suits. He was in a t-shirt and jeans, relaxed in a way I had never once seen on him. Beside him stood a blonde woman, and gripping his hand was a small boy of about 5. The child had Declan's exact jawline, the same high forehead, the same inquisitive tilt of the head. This was taken 3 weeks ago. Aldrich said, the faint smell of his leather holster reaching me in the cramped space. He is not just a mole, Conrad. He is a bigamist with a documented active second life. That boy. I whispered, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth clicked together. He looks just like Declan did in those old surveillance photos you showed me. The realization of a double-layered betrayal landed like a physical blow. All those business trips, all those late nights, supposedly at the office in Charlotte, he had been rotating between lives, sustaining a household that had no knowledge Petra existed. "Ma, he has a son," Aldrich said, his voice flat and clinical. "An 8-year-old boy named Owen. His real wife, her name is Sandra, lives in a safe house in Indiana under a false identity furnished by the Covenant. She believes Declan is a traveling consultant. The boy has no idea his father is married to someone else. The boss has known about them the entire time. He's been holding Owen's safety over Declan's head for years, Conrad. If Declan ever tried to walk away, if he ever showed mercy to your family, the Covenant would kill the boy. That's how they guarantee loyalty. Not ideology, not money. The threat of murdering the people their operatives love most. Owen is the chain that keeps Declan bound to this." Neva moved closer, the blue flicker of the monitors reflecting off the folder still in my hands. She walked me through the operational logistics, the Covenant's resources marshaled to construct airtight shell companies and meticulously layered travel itineraries. Every holiday, every anniversary, every emergency that pulled him away from our dinner table mid-conversation calculated rotations between his 2 worlds. He was a house with 2 front doors, and we were the ones locked in the basement of his lies. The structural integrity of everything I'd called reality had been fully liquidated, leaving me with an intellectual vertigo that made the floor feel like it was listing under my feet. "He's been running both sides for a decade," Neva said, her voice tight with a cold, professional fury. "Petra was the job. Indiana was the life. Or maybe it was the other way around. It didn't matter. The result was the same. My daughter had spent 8 years sharing her bed with a man who was functionally a ghost. A master of mirrors who had been erasing our family's reality to serve a mission of revenge. I stared at the photo of the young boy and saw the true blood legacy of the man Neva had put in prison, now being groomed for the next generation. He wasn't just lying to us. He was erasing us. I could see the cycle of violence being loaded up and readied to fire again. The weight of the brass key in my pocket stopped feeling like a burden and became something else entirely. Something edged. A cold, sharp determination moved through me and took hold. I didn't just invite a monster into my house. I said, my voice barely a rasp. I invited a ghost, but the piece that chilled me most was what Aldrich said next. The Indiana family wasn't simply Declan's private life. They were collateral held by the Covenant's boss, to guarantee Declan carried our execution through to the end. My fingers curled into a fist as I looked at Aldrich and said quietly, "We're out of time, aren't we?" He didn't even turn toward the monitors to answer. Holding my phone felt like gripping a live grenade. One wrong word, one small tremor in my voice, and I'd be the one pulling the pin on my daughter's life. I reached for the device in the quiet of the safe house, my thumb hovering over Petra's name. Neva stood behind me like a statue cut from ice, her hand on my shoulder, with a grip that was far more tactical than tender. I wasn't calling just to hear my daughter's voice. I was the bait for a digital trap, a mechanism for Aldrich to triangulate the precise GPS position of Declan's vehicle. My engineer's mind tried to calculate the exact pitch required a father's voice, warm enough to read, as natural, steady enough, not to betray a man who had just watched his wife return from the dead. I hit dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each tone striking my ear like a hammer on hollow pipe. "Breathe, Conrad." Neva whispered, her breath close against my neck. "You're her father. Just her father." I shut my eyes and reached for the man I had been before the funeral, before the brass key, before the lies. "I don't know if I can do this," I murmured. Then the line opened. "Daddy." Petra's voice was raw, worn down to the bone by a day spent burying a mother who was standing 3 feet behind me. "I was just about to call you. Declan said we needed some air, the house was getting too small." In the background, I caught the low, steady hum of a car engine, and then the distinct, rhythmic tick of a turn signal, the most ordinary sound in the world. Right now, it sounded like a clock counting down. A phone call is just a bridge made of air, and I was watching mine come apart before I could cross it. "Where are you, sweetheart?" I asked, pressing my voice into the shape of weary concern. "We're just heading out a private dinner somewhere near the river," she said, her breathing a little shallow. "Declan wants to get away from the mourners. How do you tell your child that the man beside her is a sleeper agent without making her the next casualty?" I could feel Declan's presence through the speaker, one hand easy on the wheel, the other likely checking the mirrors. "Tell Declan to drive carefully," I said, my heart hammering. "It gets foggy near the river this time of year." I heard a muffled exchange inside the car, the low register of a male voice I had once trusted completely. "He says he's got it." "Daddy," Petra replied, her voice fading slightly. "He says he's taking care of everything." That easy phrase chilled me straight through. It was the language of total control, a man who had already moved her away from her friends, her cousins, and was now in the final stages of moving her away from the world itself. I ended the call with a hollow promise to see her tomorrow. Words that tasted like a cruel joke even as I said them. I lowered the phone and looked at Aldrich, who was fixed on the glowing monitor in front of him. A blinking red dot was moving steadily toward the industrial district, nowhere near any restaurant worth the name. He turned to face me, expression grave, and breathed the words that stopped my heart cold. "He's not taking her to a restaurant, Conrad. He's walking her into the dark." Fletcher's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face washed in cold blue monitor light as he chased a phantom through Charlotte's digital grid. I stood rooted to the spot behind him, heart slamming against my ribs in a frantic arrhythmic beat that matched the stuttering red dot crawling across the screen. The cold blue glow threw long skeletal shadows across the corrugated metal walls of the safe house, turning the room into something that felt like an industrial tomb. I watched Petra's GPS signal veer sharply away from the main road, abandoning any route that might lead to a restaurant or commercial strip. Declan wasn't simply driving her somewhere. He had a tactical backup unit from the Covenant riding behind him there, to make sure the job got done. Fletcher pulled up a live traffic feed from a nearby intersection, the grainy footage catching the silver sedan as it blew through a yellow light. The car moved with a frightening, deliberate speed that made a mockery of any pretense about a casual dinner. "He's heading for the old textile district," Fletcher muttered, eyes never straying from the display. "Nothing out there but rust and regret." I leaned in over his shoulder, cold sweat soaking into my collar. "Zoom in," I said, my voice splitting on the words. "I need to see if she's still in the passenger seat." A second camera feed blinked to life, catching a black SUV sliding in behind Declan's car, the same heavy-framed vehicle Neva had identified from the cemetery surveillance footage. Information is a lifeline in a storm. I was watching hours fray down to a single shivering thread. That SUV has been on them since they left the cemetery gates. Neva whispered, her hand tightening on my arm hard enough to bruise. "He's not just her husband anymore, Conrad. He's her escort to the execution." Whatever remained of my composure finally gave way. I saw the coordination, the sheer cold scale of the entrapment, and understood that my daughter was being delivered to a welcoming party of monsters. We watched the silver sedan and its predator escort swing toward the shadow of a massive derelict warehouse by the riverbank. The ozone from the overheating computers hit my nostrils, a sharp, metallic bite that felt like the end of the line. Then, just as the vehicle slipped into the blind spot of the last functioning street camera, the red dot on Fletcher's monitor flickered once and died. Black. The screen went as black as a fresh grave. A signal lost alert began strobing in a slow, haunting red pulse against the safe house wall. Signal's gone. Fletcher barked into his headset. "He's jammed it." A deliberate kill command had been pushed to the phone to cut us off from tracking any further. "She's in the dark, Fletcher." I choked the words out, the air suddenly too thick to pull into my lungs. "My baby is in the dark." I stared at the dead screen, the silence pressing down so heavily I could hear the hum of the computer fans like the drone of flies over a wound. The voyeuristic terror of the digital chase had been swallowed whole by a suffocating panic that threatened to pull me under. Fletcher didn't hesitate. He drove his fist into the desktop, rattling every monitor on the rack, and shouted into his headset with a raw, tactical urgency. There at the river launched the birds. The calm efficiency of the safe house dissolved in an instant, replaced by the staccato bark of Fletcher's orders and the high-pitched whine of drones launching from a hidden bay on the roof. The sudden surge of tactical noise rang in my ears, a chaotic symphony marking the end of the digital shadow dance. Fletcher wasn't just putting eyes in the sky. He explained as he worked that these birds carried electromagnetic pulse emitters. If things turned, he was ready to fry every circuit in that district, even if it cost us our own connection. I watched the monitors flicker and roll as they switched to thermal imaging, scanning the rusted skeletons of the Catawba Industrial District. The smell of hot electronics and ozone packed the small room, a sharp metallic reminder that we were no longer just watching from a distance. Neva stood rigid beside me, eyes tracking the green and gray heat signatures on screen with a practiced, predatory focus. It was the look of a hunter who had cut a fresh trail, and it frightened me almost as much as the threat against our daughter. "I need eyes on that warehouse," Fletcher shouted into his headset. "If they go inside, we lose the thermal lock." "Conrad, stay back from the consoles. You're shaking so badly, you're going to trip a sensor." I hadn't realized I was trembling until I reached out to brace myself against the metal desk. The full weight of the system blackout hit me like a physical blow. Without the phone's GPS, we were guessing from trajectory, hurling high-tech darts into the dark. I began pacing the narrow aisle of the safe house, my engineer's mind spiraling as I calculated the sheer footprint of those abandoned buildings. Have you ever watched your entire world reduced to a field of green and gray heat blobs on a monitor and realized that your own heartbeat was the only warm thing left in the room? A cold sweat pricked the back of my neck as the full dimension of the trap came into focus. "He's playing with us, Neva," I said, my voice cracking on the words. He knew we were watching. She didn't look at me, her eyes locked on a grainy image of a massive iron structure. "No, Conrad," she answered, her voice stripped of every trace of the warmth I'd known across our marriage. "He doesn't know about the safe house. He's just running the protocol his father taught him. Silence is the first rule of the hit." The drone feed finally reached the old textile warehouse, but the thick, rusted metal roof acted as a heat shield, defeating the thermal sensors entirely. We could see the white-hot engine glow of the idling SUV outside, a beacon of malice, but the interior was an impenetrable black void. Fletcher swore as the screen filled with digital artifacts and static. "We're blind," he growled. "Interior is dead air. He's running a localized scrambler." Nothing. The warehouse was a tomb of cold iron. "Then we go," I said, the helplessness in my chest hardening into something sharp and jagged. "Now, before the dark becomes permanent." Neva finally turned to face me, her expression grim. She revealed she had known about this particular warehouse for years. It was a Covenant cleaning station, a place engineered for making people disappear without a trace. I watched the static churn across the monitor, a blizzard of black and gray, and understood with a sickening lurch that the only way to know what was happening to my daughter was to walk into that darkness myself. Neva didn't look at me as she reached beneath the console and pulled out a tactical vest. To understand the monster who currently held my daughter, I had to look back at the day my wife had accidentally created him. She stood bathed in the blue-tinted glow of the safe house, eyes distant, transporting me back to 1994, back to the jagged wreckage of the Covenant's main headquarters during the final federal raid. I could almost smell the plaster dust and cordite hanging in the air of that memory. Amid the tactical chaos and the falling masonry of the leader's office, she had found young Declan, an 8-year-old, with eyes as cold and still as a frozen pond, sitting in the rubble of a billion-dollar empire without shedding a single tear. While federal agents scrambled to secure millions in illegal ledgers and shouted orders over one another, Neva had locked eyes with the boy. "He didn't cry," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. "He didn't even blink while we hauled his father away in chains. He wasn't some random recruit swept up in the chaos of the aftermath. He was a disciple groomed specifically by the boss, since the age of 8, to carry out exactly this revenge. I thought he was a victim back then." My heart broke for the boy sitting alone in those ruins. I was wrong. He wasn't a victim. He was an apprentice, watching his world burn and memorizing the faces of the people holding the matches. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a timer counting down for 30 years. Neva explained that the Covenant's leader had left nothing about his legacy to chance. He had spent years conditioning the boy to see the law not as protection, but as a gang of thieves who had stolen his birthright. My pulse hammered in my ears as the full horror of that conditioning sank in. "We thought we were saving him," Neva said, her fingers tracing the cold, tactile edge of an old evidence photo on the monitor. The boss was already whispering instructions into his ear through prison glass before the ink on the arrest warrants had even dried. He was 8. I kept asking myself how an 8-year-old could carry that much hatred, but the answer was right there on the screen in front of me. Hate is a structural flaw. It grows in the dark. And we were the ones who switched off the lights. Neva's confession took a darker turn when she admitted she was the one who had personally signed the paperwork that placed Declan into the foster system, as a child convinced it was the only way to give him a clean start. In doing so, she had unknowingly handed him the perfect cover he needed to grow up, shed his name, and begin his long, patient hunt for our family. She was the unwitting architect of our own infiltration, the one who passed the wolf the key to the sheepfold. I stared at the monitors at that dark warehouse hulking by the river and understood that Declan wasn't simply working for a criminal boss. He was trying to reclaim the father my wife had taken from him. Those young, frozen eyes haunted me. A ghost raised for war now standing over my daughter with a knife tucked inside his smile. We weren't just fighting a mole. We were fighting 30 years of patient, carefully tended rage. I drove my fist down onto the workstation's cold metal surface, the impact rattling the monitors and shattering the heavy silence of the safe house. The sting in my knuckles was a sharp, welcome distraction from the suffocating terror clawing at my throat. I stood over those consoles, staring into the black void on the screens, where my daughter's life was being erased in real time. "You are an Agent Aldrich, but I am her father," I said, my voice thrumming with a raw, paternal ferocity I hadn't felt in decades. "I am the only bridge she has left. I am not sitting here while she is trapped inside a cleaning station." Aldrich didn't move, his eyes fixed on the rolling drone feed logs. "You'll get yourself killed before you even reach the perimeter, Conrad!" He shot back, his tone clipped and professional. "My team is moving as fast as the protocols allow." But as I watched him, I caught the flicker of hesitation behind his eyes. My engineer's mind, trained to detect the faintest structural shift, recognized that Aldrich wasn't simply following a manual. He was operating under orders to bring the Covenant boss in alive, even if that priority raised the risk to Petra. Have you ever looked at a federal agent and realized that to the institution he serves, your daughter's life is just a line item in a ledger? I was not going to let her become the acceptable loss in his career-defining bust. Neva stepped into the light, her face a mask of tactical resolve. "He's right, Aldrich," she said, her voice cutting clean through the tension. "Declan doesn't fear the Bureau. He fears his own conscience, and he only listens to family." She began pulling tactical gear from a hidden locker, the metallic snap of buckles echoing in the room like a clock counting down. Aldrich realized he had lost control of his witnesses. "Fine," he barked, yanking a comms earpiece from his pocket. "But you follow my lead, or I will have you both in federal custody before the sun comes up." The preparation passed in a blur of steel and nylon. Conrad was fitted with a low-profile tactical vest, its weight settling onto my shoulders and making the danger feel physical rather than digital. The fluorescent lights threw a cold glare across the gear. Neva worked the straps of my vest, her eyes finding mine with a fierce, private intensity. As she tightened the last buckle, she leaned in her body, shielding the motion, and slipped something into a hidden pocket of her own rig, a secondary personal insurance policy that I knew Aldrich had never authorized. The smell of gun oil and faint floor wax hung in the cramped space. Aldrich stepped toward me, his face grave. "Don't be a hero, Conrad. Just be a father." At this point, Aldrich, I don't see the difference, I answered, the static hum of the earpiece already buzzing to life. Click. The earpiece fit like a death sentence. Aldrich handed me the comms unit, his eyes searching my face for any crack in my foundation. He found nothing but the cold, hard resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. The humidity of the Catawba hit me like a physical blow, a wet, heavy shroud that reeked of river mud and dying industry. As we stepped out of the sterile, filtered air of the storage complex, the night swallowed us whole. I felt the comms earpiece pressing cold against my ear, a tiny vibrating thread connecting me to Aldrich that felt increasingly fragile against the vast, dark silence of the riverbank. We pushed through a dense wall of riverbank vegetation along a path that looked to me like nothing more than shadows and rot. Neva, though, moved through the terrain with a terrifying, fluid silence I had never once witnessed across 3 decades of marriage. She was not the woman I had shared coffee with every morning. She was a predator returning to a familiar hunting ground. I watched her hand snap out in a series of sharp signal gestures, quick wrist flicks and deliberate finger positions I didn't recognize. Her retirement had been a lie even to me. She had been maintaining specialized training while I spent my days inspecting bridge joints. "Watch your step, Conrad," she breathed, her voice barely a ripple in the humid air. "Sound carries over water better than over land." "You've done this before," I murmured, catching my boot on the skeleton of a rusted machine. "This exact walk." She didn't answer, her focus locked on the hulking silhouette of the abandoned textile warehouse that rose out of the fog. It was a cathedral of corrugated iron and rotted timber, its jagged roofline lit by sputtering orange perimeter lamps that threw jittery finger-like shadows across the ground. This warehouse was a rusted lung, and we were the unwanted breath being drawn into its dark, hollow chest. My inspector's eye mapped the structural decay immediately: the sagging roofline, the deep fractures spreading through the brickwork, the heavy reinforced steel doors. Declan had chosen this location well. The thickness of those walls would swallow a scream whole. "East wall is compromised," I whispered, directing her attention to a visible lean in the masonry. "If we have to run, we go through the loading dock. It's the only exit with structural integrity." She nodded, eyes already sweeping the perimeter. "Check your comms," she said. "Once we're inside, Aldrich is our only lifeline." The crickets, which had been a deafening wall of sound moments earlier, fell suddenly silent, leaving a void that made my ears ring. We reached the service entrance, a small, dented door tucked behind a stack of rusted chemical drums. The smell of stagnant river water and old oil was suffocating here, a metallic cocktail that tasted of fear. I turned the brass key in my pocket over in my fingers, the object that had upended my entire life, and knew it wouldn't open this door. Creak. The metal groaned like a wounded man as I tested the handle. My pulse hammered against my wrists, a terrifying, irreversible commitment locking itself around my limbs. The door wasn't locked from the outside. It had been left ajar, a silent invitation for us to walk straight into the center of the trap. I glanced at Neva and watched her check that hidden insurance policy in her gear one final time. "Ready?" she asked. "No," I replied, my voice a dry rasp. "But I'm going anyway." I gripped the cold handle, and as the door swung inward without a sound, the first thing the flickering light showed me was the back of my daughter's head, and the man she loved holding a gun to it. The interior was a cathedral of rot, vast and alive with the sound of the river working against the pilings. The reek of decaying timber and stagnant water meant nothing beside the metallic taste of my own fear as I stepped into that hollow, rusted nave. Beside me, Neva moved like a phantom, nearly undetectable as our eyes adjusted to the pitch-black shadows concealing decades of industrial decay. At the very center of the massive space, a single industrial lamp swung from a frayed cable, its slow pendulum casting a harsh, flickering orange cone that carved a stage out of the surrounding darkness. "Stay low," Neva breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "The echoes in here are our worst enemy." I felt the comms earpiece cold against my skin, but there was only static now, the warehouse's iron shell blocking out the world beyond its walls. "I see her," I murmured, my heart lurching in a jagged, desperate rhythm. "I see our little girl." Petra was bound to a heavy wooden chair positioned dead center in that cone of light. Her face was streaked with tears, mascara tracking in black rivulets down both cheeks. Her wrists were bound so tightly with nylon rope that I could make out the red welts even from the shadows where we stood. A gag was tied cruelly around her mouth, biting into the corners of her lips. But what broke me wasn't the physical restraints. It was her eyes. They were wide, glassy, and utterly defeated, the eyes of someone who had already stopped expecting rescue. My brilliant daughter, the pediatric cardiologist, who spent her days mending children's hearts, looked like a broken doll abandoned at the center of a stage built for her execution. Declan Veitch stood directly behind her, one hand resting on the back of the chair with a proprietary coldness that made my blood boil. He had lit the warehouse with surgical precision, ensuring that whoever came for her would see exactly what he intended them to see. A victim ready for the end? The man my daughter had once called perfection had vanished, replaced by a calculating predator who stared straight into the darkness toward our position, as though he had been counting our heartbeats all along. A bridge collapses when the load exceeds what the steel can bear. In this room, my heart was the bridge, and the sight of my daughter was a weight I wasn't certain I could hold. Every instinct I carried as a father screamed at me to charge into that circle of light, to tear Declan apart with my bare hands. Don't look at his eyes. Neva's hand clamped onto my arm with bruising force. Look at his hands. He's waiting for us. This isn't a hiding spot. It's a stage. As I braced to step forward, the shadows ringing the light began to move. The flickering orange glow exposed the silhouettes of 4 men emerging from behind rusted machinery rifles leveled at the entrance. Click. The sound of 4 safeties being released echoed through the space like a firing squad drawing breath. My strategic despair deepened as I registered how badly we were outgunned. Aldrich had better be as close as he claims. I thought, though, the silence in my ear told a different story. These Covenant guards weren't simply there to protect Declan. Their rigid, watchful posture told me they were there to make sure he carried the hit through to the end, cutting off any last-minute mercy toward the family he had lived among for a decade. Declan slowly raised his eyes toward the shadows where we stood, his face lit by the swaying lamp, and he smiled a cold, hollow smile that told me he had been tracking our footsteps from the moment we crossed the river. He knew we were there. He knew we had nowhere left to go. Neva squeezed my hand, either a silent goodbye or a declaration of war. I couldn't tell which. And then she stepped into the cone of light. Without hesitation, she walked into that harsh orange circle with the terrifying composure of a predator returning to a kill she had never actually finished. The rhythmic flicker of the industrial lamp overhead drew deep shadows across her face, making her look less like my wife and more like a vengeful spirit summoned from the river fog. Surprised Declan, she said, her voice cutting through the smell of ozone and wet timber like a blade. I'm not as easy to put in the ground as a few sandbags. Tied to the heavy wooden chair, Petra let out a muffled, strangled cry behind her gag, her body lurching against the ropes. Mom! Petra's voice cracked the moment Declan ripped the gag free, barely a whisper, the sound of glass giving way. Her face went white, then red, then white again, as shock and disbelief collided in real time. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks in a torrent. You're alive. How is this? How? She tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her, still weak from hours in that chair. Her entire body shook with sobs that were equal parts relief and complete cognitive fracture. She stared at her mother the way a person stares at a ghost, her mind visibly struggling to reconcile the woman she had buried with the woman standing 10 feet away, alive and armed. Her eyes were blown wide with a mixture of hysterical joy and absolute disbelief as she looked at the mother she had watched disappear into the North Carolina clay. Declan's hand, the one that had rested with such cold ownership on the back of Petra's chair, began to twitch. The calculated predatory mask he had worn since the cemetery didn't just crack. It shattered. His mind was clearly fighting to reconcile the clinical finality of the heart attack report with the breathing, lethal woman standing 10 feet in front of him. He looked at her the way a man looks at his own executioner. I saw the medical reports myself." Declan stammered, his face draining to the color of ash. "I personally checked the hospital logs. I watched the casket go into the ground." Neva tilted her head, a cold, predatory smile settling on her lips. "You saw what a professional wanted you to see, Declan. You were always just an amateur playing at my game, and you spent 10 years failing to spot the structural flaws in your own infiltration. A lie is a structural flaw. Once it's exposed to the light, the whole building begins to groan." I stepped out from the shadows, then moving up alongside Neva, my heart hammering a war drum against my ribs. The comms unit sat cold and useless in my ear, the iron walls having swallowed our signal whole. But I didn't need Aldrich to tell me what came next. The Covenant guards tightened their grips on their rifles, eyes cutting toward Declan for a command that never came. He was caught in a mental loop, the conditioned loyalty to his prison father slamming head-on into the sheer impossibility of our presence. "Let her go, Declan," I said, my voice rolling through that cathedral of rot. "It is over. Every 'I love you' you whispered to my daughter across 8 years of marriage is a debt you can never repay." He looked at me, then back at Neva, his eyes glazed with a rising panic. "It is never over," he whispered, his voice splitting like dry wood. "He said it would never be over. He told me you were gone." Declan's gaze cut toward a laptop resting on a crate near the chair, and I watched the exact moment his fear of the living woman in front of him was overtaken by an even greater terror, the man watching from prison. He wasn't just a husband who had been caught. He was a disciple who had failed his God. He had been the one to confirm the death to the boss, the one who guaranteed the Halfords were no longer a threat. Now standing in the flickering orange light, he understood precisely what being wrong would cost him. I moved closer, my shadow merging with Neva's, and looked my daughter in the eyes. I watched the exact moment her entire reality turned to ash. Petra was still bound to that chair, the industrial light overhead swaying and sending shadows dancing across her tear-streaked face. Declan stood frozen, but I had stopped caring about his shock. I had a blow to deliver, the one that would finally sever the cord between them. I reached into the pocket of my tactical vest and pulled out the glossy surveillance photo Aldrich had given me. It felt heavier than it had any right to, a piece of evidence carrying the weight of a death sentence. I dropped it at Petra's feet. The bigamy reveal was the only tool left to destroy Declan's grip on her heart. "He's not just a criminal, Petra," I said, my voice steady despite the burning heat behind my eyes. "He's a bigamist. He has a primary wife and a biological son in Indianapolis, Indiana, who looks just like him." I held Declan's gaze, my jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Tell her, Declan. Tell her about the woman in Indianapolis. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every manufactured emergency that pulled him away from our family, all of it was just a return to his real life. A bridge doesn't simply snap. It corrodes from the inside until the mere weight of a shadow can bring it down. 11 years of rust had just met the light." Petra's muffled sobbing grew louder, a strangled sound of absolute despair. I forced her to face the decaying decade of her life. 11 years, honey. 3 years of dating and 8 years of marriage. All of it for a ledger and a prison grudge. You weren't his wife. You were his assignment, a tool for bypassing your mother's defenses. He targeted you when you were 16, a child, because the Covenant boss ordered him to. The reek of grease and wet iron in the warehouse felt suffocating as I laid out the cold logistics of their scheme. Every holiday, every birthday, even her wedding day, all of it was nothing more than evidence in a decade-long crime. The weight of the truth seemed to physically crush her, and her cries gradually faded into a hollow, terrifying silence. 0. That was the value placed on my daughter's love in his ledger. Declan finally found his voice. Before I take you into what came next and what it cost every person in that room, let me ask you this. If someone you loved had been living an entirely different life right beside you, would you want to know the whole truth at once, or would you need to find it piece by piece? Hold on to your answer, because what happens next changes everything. The man Petra had fallen in love with wasn't the one doing the talking. What came out of his mouth was the flat, mechanical cadence of a trained operative. His eyes swept over her with the cold assessment of someone tallying inventory. A mission. He said his words absorbed by the vast darkness around us. That's all this ever was. Shakti, every moment of it scripted. I executed what my conditioning demanded. The man who pulled me out of the wreckage your mother left behind, he has always had my first allegiance. Not a single fragment of the husband she'd built her life around remained. He'd peeled the persona off like a work uniform, exposing the truth that 8 years of tenderness had been nothing more than operational camouflage. He was something that had worn the face of love until the disguise finally burned through. Petra's chin dropped to her chest, something inside her caving at last, the final beam giving way in a structure already too compromised to stand. Then Declan's whole bearing shifted his attention, snapping to the laptop, casting its cold blue glow from the crate beside him. But then the script changed, he breathed. Something none of us planned for. That was the first crack I'd seen in him, a hairline fault running through stone that had held since the moment we arrived. The alert that chimed from that laptop was nothing like a routine ping. It was the drop of a blade finding its groove. Declan went rigid, all remaining professional composure draining from his face and replaced by something naked and animal pure terror without any filter left on it. I was standing 3 feet back, my palms so slick with sweat, the tactical vest felt like I was wearing poured concrete. The screen opened on a face carved in shadow and high contrast, the Covenant leader transmitting live from inside a federal cell. A graveled, distorted rasp poured out of the speakers and filled every corner of the warehouse, drowning out the river's steady rhythm against the pilings. He didn't acknowledge Neva. He didn't acknowledge me. He bore down on Declan with the suffocating closeness of a father who has never needed to raise his voice to make a point. "You're dragging your feet, Declan." The boss's image stuttered through digital interference, his tone serrated at the edges. "Sentiment is not something I built into you. I'm verifying the targets, father." Declan's hand had started to shake badly enough that the gun barrel carved loose, wobbling circles in the air between us. Have you ever been in the room when a man's soul gives out, no crack, no crash, and yet somehow it's the loudest thing you've ever heard? I watched the man who had spent a decade embedded in my family fold in front of a glowing rectangle. Then the screen split in two. The second panel pulling up a grainy live feed, a suburban property in Indiana. The same address I'd studied in Aldrich's surveillance files. A figure in a dark hoodie occupied the front step, a device in hand, waiting. Declan's legs went out from under him, knees hitting the concrete, the gun sagging floorward. "Blood is the only currency loyalty accepts, Declan." The boss delivered it like a diagnosis. "The Halfords draw breath or your own flesh pays the difference. Keep him out of it." Declan's voice shattered on the words. "He's a child. By bond, that child is my heir." The boss came back. And every second you stall is a second charged against his account. Tick, tick, tick. The clock wasn't running on any screen. It was running in the tremor of Declan's grip. It landed on me, then the villain here was also a hostage. His compliance was being purchased with the threatened murder of his own son. The Covenant boss had seen this fault line coming and had stationed his people at Declan's real front door as a guaranteed failsafe. Across the warehouse floor, the guards redistributed their aim rifles, now covering Declan, alongside the three of us, everyone waiting on the word from the screen. End them. The boss ordered, his eyes like two holes punched through the pixelated image. Or stand on your porch and watch everything you built get buried. 10 seconds. The ozone and overheated electronics smell seemed to press in closer around me. I studied the weapon quivering in my son-in-law's fist, then the absolute dread behind his eyes, and I understood we were all weight-bearing members of a bridge that had already begun to fail. The boss angled toward the camera, his demand reverberating off the corrugated iron. Pull the trigger, Declan. 1 against 3. Choose. I looked at my daughter lashed to that chair, then back at the man caught between the order he'd been given and the blood he shared. I stepped forward into the trajectory of that barrel, not out of courage, but out of professional instinct. A bridge inspector understands that when failure is imminent, you throw yourself at the most stressed point. I put my body between Declan's shaking weapon and Petra, as though I could physically absorb the 3 decades of toxin that had been pumped into him. The boss's graveled distortion kept clawing out of the laptop speakers, a pixelated specter that wanted nothing but blood. Declan. My voice came out low and anchored, steady enough that even the guards in the periphery seemed to flinch at it. Take your eyes off that screen. Look at the man who shared your Thanksgiving table for 10 years running. The one who got his hands dirty next to you rebuilding a carburetor. The one who handed you his daughter and meant it. Tears were cutting trails down Declan's face. His knuckles bone white around the grip, his whole body broadcasting a war happening somewhere deeper than muscle or bone. You lost a father when you were a boy. I pressed, closing the distance until the barrel's heat was something I could feel at my sternum. I've watched what that absence carved into you across every family meal we ever shared, Declan. A man who goes looking for revenge on behalf of a ghost is building his house on rubble. Don't do that. Look at Petra. She is not a line in an operations brief. She's the person who memorized exactly how you drink your coffee. She sat up through the night every time you ran a fever. She gave you something real, Declan, not the instrument they shaped you into. You squeeze that trigger, you're not ending us. You're incinerating the one place that ever treated you like a person. Another step. My voice beginning to fracture at the edges. Your boy Owen is 8 years old, Declan. That's the same age the system swallowed you whole when your father was taken. You do this tonight, and you are handing Owen the identical inheritance that hatred outlasts love, that a dead man's grudge is worth more than a living child's future. Is that the lesson another generation raised as a ghost's disciple? Or does it stop here? When you're pleading for your child, the words aren't formed in your mouth. They push up from somewhere deep in the skeletal frame of you. I could taste my own tears, the warehouse thick around me with the bite of old oil and river damp. I told them I'd had the comms earpiece live the whole time, recording every syllable, and that Aldrich's unit was already running the confession against the Indiana address, triangulating Owen's location in real time. Aldrich has people converging on your house in Indianapolis right now, Declan. You make the call tonight, and the Bureau walks Owen out of there clean. This chain of blood can snap right here in this room. What does Owen become? Another instrument for a dead man, or someone who actually gets to live? His soul was a seized bolt, and I was every ounce of torque I had left trying to break it free before the whole assembly gave out. Then, through a choked admission, Declan confessed that hunting Petra hadn't been purely operational. He'd gravitated toward our family because he'd been starving ever since that 1994 raid, hungry for what he'd glimpsed, but never been allowed to have. He had wanted to belong to the Halfords, not to the Vetch name. 3 seconds, Declan. The boss's pixelated face was a mask of fury from the crate. They die or the boy does. Do it now. I watched Declan's finger curl tighter around the trigger. Every molecule of tension in that room had passed whatever threshold physics allows. I won't let him turn into you. Declan breathed barely sound at all, just a broken serrated thing hanging in the air. The standoff solidified into something physical, a silence pressing down with the mass of a collapsing structure. Petra had gone utterly still behind me, her sobbing cut off as she watched the man she'd loved reach the last crossroads he would ever stand at. Then Declan's arm swung violent and sudden, driven by something that had finally come apart inside him. The muzzle didn't come to rest on my chest. It didn't find Petra's head. It locked onto the pixelated face of the man who had spent 30 years turning him into a weapon and aimed at nothing else. He wasn't targeting us. He was targeting the origin of everything that had hollowed him out. The shot that followed wasn't a conclusion. It was a thunderclap of liberation. It tore through the tyrant's face on that screen and detonated the warehouse into immediate violent disorder. Declan put the round directly through the laptop. The casing split in a burst of sparks and shattered display. The boss's graveled voice was severed in the middle of his threat, and the center of the warehouse dropped into a ringing, vibrating silence that held for barely the span of a single heartbeat. The gun hit the floor the instant Declan let it go. His first move after turning on his mentor wasn't to run or negotiate. It was to hurl himself across Petra, draping his own chest over her bound body as a living barrier against the 4 Covenant guards who had just registered his betrayal. "Get down now!" He bellowed, his voice splitting under 10 years of compressed feeling. The guards were already wheeling around, their expressions hardening into the cold, precise fury of men who had just been given new orders. "Traitor, finish all of them." One barked, swinging his rifle up toward the back of Declan's skull. Before any of them could get their sights aligned, the warehouse's main corrugated doors blew inward under a series of shaped charges. The concussive wave was seismic. It hammered my sternum and stripped the air clean from my lungs. Flashbang grenades arced through the smoke, detonating in a rapid, blinding sequence of white light and skull-rattling percussion that locked every Covenant member in place. Flash. Boom. The world went white and held. My engineering instincts, always tracking structural load and failure points, read the breach locations by the pattern of vibrations traveling up through the floor as the FBI tactical teams poured in from the perimeter. FBI weapons down, on the ground now. The commands rang through that hollow space like a bell struck in a cathedral. I grabbed Neva and hauled her low behind a cluster of rusted chemical drums, just as the first shots were exchanged. "Conrad, Neva, stay flat." Fletcher Aldrich's voice knifed through the metallic ringing in my ears, clipped and in command. He drove through the churning haze with his weapon up and steady his team fanning wide to bracket the center of the room. The warehouse had stopped being a building. It was a drum skin being beaten by a dozen automatic weapons simultaneously. Cordite and ozone burned in my throat, the smell of a confrontation 30 years in the making. Aldrich moved through the smoke the way a current moves through water, purposeful and quiet, directing his team to secure the center. "Lock down the woman, contain the primary target," he called out. It registered then that the breach wasn't simply a reaction to the shot Declan had fired. Aldrich had been riding my live comms the entire time, listening to every word of that conversation, and had timed the breach for the precise moment the boss's face disappeared from the screen. Through the smoke and the lurching strobe of the failing industrial lamp, I caught a Covenant guard pulling himself back together. He drew a bead on Declan's unprotected back, disregarding the tactical team entirely, one last payment of dark loyalty. The man who had just chosen fatherhood over his mission was about to be killed for it. The first round missed Declan's skull by an inch, sparks skipping off the lamp housing behind him as the warehouse erupted into the controlled thunder of tactical gunfire. I pressed myself low, the vest rough against my ribs' ears, screaming with a high-pitched whine that felt like the pitch of a world coming apart at its seams. Aldrich didn't pause. He put a single surgical round into the guard's shoulder, enough to drop the rifle clattering to the concrete and no more. Then a sharp, concussive pulse rolled through the room, the secondary insurance policy Neva had hidden in her gear, the EMP device she'd slipped in back at the safe house. Not a miscalculation. A planned move designed to kill the warehouse lights and destroy any remote detonators the Covenant might have staged. The space dropped into absolute black. And after that, only the green-tinted geometry of night vision guided the tactical team through the remainder of the siege. I pressed against the rusted drums and watched through the haze as the FBI's numbers overwhelmed the last of the guards, finishing it in near-total darkness. "All clear, targets down!" The shout bounced through the empty upper reaches of the warehouse. When the emergency backup lights stuttered on, Aldrich crossed to the center of the room and drew a combat knife, slicing through Petra's restraints in 2 quick strokes. She pitched forward, but she didn't reach for Neva. She didn't reach for anyone. Her body folded toward the floor, shaking with a level of shock that had moved well past the physical. I shoved through the ring of agents and caught her, my fingers fighting with the gag that had been biting into her face. The bridge had been pulled back from demolition, but the foundation beneath it had fractured so deeply that even the softest footstep felt like a threat to whatever was left standing. "It's me, sweetheart. Daddy's here. You're safe now," I whispered, trying to draw her in. She went rigid, her eyes filmed over and tracking something far past my face. "Don't..." Her voice came out scraped and hollow. "Don't touch me. It's all fake. It's all fake." The smell of river mud soaked into her clothes was sharp and close, a reminder of the filth that had been heaped on all of us. My chest caved as I understood she wasn't pushing me away specifically. She was pushing away the entire architecture of a family that had been built on decades of buried lies. Behind us, 2 agents hauled Declan upright. His expensive jacket was in shreds, his face a record of the night's violence. He didn't fight them. Click. The handcuffs snapped shut, the only ring he had any right to wear. He looked toward Petra with a hollow, begging expression, but Neva stepped into the space between them, her gaze offering nothing. Aldrich read him his rights in a flat monotone as they walked him toward the waiting black SUV outside. The man who had occupied the son-in-law seat at my table for 11 years was now a federal prisoner, a ghost being walked back into the dark. I held my daughter while she shook, feeling the full weight of the structural devastation that had torn through our lives. As they guided Declan toward the vehicle, he turned and looked back at me and shaped 3 words with his mouth that turned the blood in my veins to ice. "Indiana isn't over." The words hung there in the humid air like something toxic, a reminder that our survival was not the same thing as our safety. The ambulance sirens cutting through the night were a mournful wail that felt like the final funeral song for everything I used to call my life. The emergency room's fluorescent glare was a brutal counterpoint to the warehouse shadows, and it exposed every crack in our family that no amount of medical attention could repair. I stood by while the paramedics transferred Petra to the hospital trauma team, my boots marking the pristine linoleum. The sterile environment felt hostile, bleached, and antiseptic, offering nothing for the mud-caked reality we'd just crawled out of. Petra remained absent behind her own eyes, staring through the doctors as though none of them registered, refusing to acknowledge the hands steadying her. The lead trauma physician, a woman in her 50s, exhausted but clear-eyed, drew me into the hallway. "She's presenting with acute dissociative shock, Mr. Halford," she said, keeping her voice low and level. "Physically severe dehydration, wrist and ankle bruising, consistent with extended restraint, early-stage hypothermia from exposure. We're addressing all of it, but the psychological damage runs considerably deeper. She's erected a barrier, a mental fortification, to keep herself from having to process what's happened. Right now, anyone she connects to the trauma, including both of you, reads as a threat to that wall. She needs time, distance, and professional intervention before she can allow you back in." Something structural gave way inside my chest as I heard it. Petra wasn't simply exhausted in body. Her spirit had quietly vacated and left no forwarding address. The hospital's safety protocols activated fast and without warmth, converting Neva and me into outsiders before we'd even had a chance to explain ourselves. Because of the nature of the assault, we were barred from the primary trauma bay, reduced to watching through the thick observation glass of the waiting area. Neva moved toward the gurney as it rolled past, and Petra's hand jerked back in a spasm, a reflexive recoil from her mother's outstretched fingers that left the air between them vibrating like a struck wire. That single flinch. It hit harder than anything the warehouse guards had aimed at us. I watched the professional mask on Neva's face give out entirely the controlled composure of a veteran agent, unable to hold any more against the grief of a mother who had come back from the dead and been received like a stranger. In the background, Fletcher Aldrich stood against a vending machine in silence, coordinating with a team in Indiana over an encrypted line. His presence carried its own low-frequency reminder that Declan's arrest had not put out every fire. "Let the doctors do their work," I said, my voice arriving hollow as I steered Neva toward the hard plastic of the waiting room chairs. "She needs room." Neva turned and looked at me, her eyes wet and carrying the weight of every year between us. "She looked at me like I was one of them, Conrad," she whispered. "Like I was the monster. Steel and concrete are only part of what holds a bridge up. What really matters is trust in the open air between one bank and the other." That gap between us and our daughter felt like it stretched for miles. Hospital ventilation droned on, filling every corner of the silence, until a neurologist finally broke from the corridor and found us beneath a ceiling light that wouldn't stop stuttering. His diagnosis came out measured but merciless. Petra had retreated behind a severe dissociative wall, her mind's own emergency measure against the twin horrors of the abduction and her mother's impossible return from the dead. He didn't dress it up. At this stage, we weren't the solution, we were part of what had broken her. The shutdown wasn't a generalized response to shock. It was her psyche barricading itself against us specifically. So we're still ghosts to her. The words fell out of my mouth before I could catch them, carrying the terrible implication that rescuing her body may have cost us her soul. Aldrich's arm dropped to his side, phone suddenly forgotten, his expression settling into the dull iron mask of someone delivering ruin wrapped in paperwork. He crossed to where we stood, lowered his voice beneath the antiseptic hum of the ward, and said the thing that snuffed out whatever hope I'd been nursing. Indiana, the team got inside, but there was nobody home. Empty. That word had become the motif running beneath every chapter of my life lately. An empty coffin, empty assurances, and now a vacant house in Indiana waiting at the end of every other thread. The danger hadn't ended. It had simply moved. The drive back to our Charlotte house passed in the kind of silence that presses down on your shoulders, heavier than the North Carolina air in high summer. When I swung the truck into our own driveway, the shape of the house against the sky looked wrong, like a prop I'd been handed without a script. We moved inside to collect Petra's belongings, two people drifting through rooms full of their own ghosts. Petra's old bedroom was a time capsule sealed at the moment, before Declan Veitch had ever cast his shadow over us. The room held the faint scent of roseau and cedar shavings. I ran my thumb along an old swimming trophy on the shelf, its metal surface cool and unapologetic under my hand. Everything honest in this house lived in small, solid objects. Because the larger structures, the ones we'd built our lives on, had been riddled with hidden fractures all along. Standing there, I felt it land hard in my chest. We had kept her alive, but the girl who once occupied this space, the one who handed her trust to the world without flinching, wasn't coming back. "I keep searching the walls for damage," Neva, I said, when she filled the doorway. "But I think I've been forgetting the foundation was compromised from the start." "We did what we had to keep her alive, Conrad," she answered. Only there was something missing from her voice, the crisp operational certainty that usually lived there. Can a person ever truly forgive the one who rescued them by shattering them? I studied her face and understood something I hadn't let myself confront before. Every raw, authentic wave of grief I'd ridden through that funeral had been functioning as cover a shield the Bureau could hide behind, precisely because it was genuine. I buried you, Neva. The weight of the dirt on my shoes, the hollow cave in my sternum. You stood back and let me come apart, because the mission required that my devastation be real enough to deceive a monster. We drifted out to the back porch as dawn crept in gray and hesitant through the tree line. Crickets held the only note worth hearing in that hour. "I wasn't asking for a performance, Conrad. What I needed was armor," she said, her composure finally fracturing as her back found the porch rail. "The one thing the Covenant couldn't see through was how much you loved me. The anger that had been hovering between us began to thin out, and what replaced it was heavier, the full shared mass of everything we'd done and failed to do. Two load-bearing columns still upright beneath a roof that the storm had long since carried off. I looked at this woman librarian federal agent, the person who had quietly paid Silas Prudhomme for 20 years to stand watch over a hollow casket, and understood the scale of what she'd architected. Decades of planning. A bridge assembled one concealed bolt at a time. My hand found hers without deciding to. Her skin was warm. It was the one thing I knew for certain right then. "Don't leave me again, Neva. Not for a mission, not for any ghost left over from this." I breathed. Her fingers tightened around mine. "Agreed. No more ghosts." The early light held us there, two people who had survived something that had no name, sitting with the knowledge that whatever road came next was going to be rough and unsteady. I was still holding her hand, still feeling that steady pulse beneath her skin when Aldrich's ringtone split everything open. The phone screen glowed like an accusation, dragging the outside world back in just when I'd almost believed we were clear of it. I put it to my ear, my whole grip tightening, half expecting the floor to give way again. Instead, Aldrich's voice arrived with a steadiness that reminded me of a key sliding home in a lock. First light out of North Carolina was painting the porch boards gold around me as I listened. "The boy is safe," Aldrich said. Declan's son had been found and moved to a secure location near Indianapolis, Indiana. The Covenant's cleanup crew had been minutes behind them. That child's recovery wasn't incidental. It had been Declan's non-negotiable price for opening up completely against the boss. Once the boy was out of reach, the hold they'd had over Declan's other life dissolved entirely. I exhaled 30 years of compressed air, leaving my body at once with Neva's hand, the only thing tethering me to the ground as the world slowed its spinning. Does Declan know? Relief made my voice sound like someone else's. Does he know the boy is out? He knows, Aldrich said. And he is talking. Everything, Aldrich said, and began walking me through the machinery of collapse. After the warehouse was hit, 47 members had been swept up across 6 states in one synchronized operation. The $1.2 billion ledger recovered from Declan's possession had handed the FBI the architecture of the entire enterprise, every pillar, every beam, every hidden load-bearing lie. 47. An empire that once moved in darkness, now reduced to a row of booking photos. The bridge Neva had begun laying in 1995 had reached the far bank. It took 30 years, Aldrich murmured. 30 years underground for a single morning where the air was finally clear. We pulled ourselves inside, drawn toward the kitchen by the ordinary smell of coffee starting to brew something so mundane it almost felt like a foreign language. I found the remote plastic smooth and familiar against my palm and brought the television to life. A blue wash of breaking news light took over the room. Locations we recognized. Faces we'd been afraid of for decades. Faces that had existed only in shadows and whispered warnings now appeared on screen beneath a chyron, identifying them as defendants in a sweeping RICO prosecution. Have you ever been in a room the moment a long-kept secret finally stops breathing, the atmosphere shifts? It gets lighter, cleaner, like pulling your first clean breath after the smoke clears. I looked at Neva and watched something settle into place. The librarian and the agent no longer two separate people, just one woman finally standing in open daylight. Look at him, Neva, I said, nodding toward the screen where the Covenant boss was being walked out in a jumpsuit. Just a man, not a ghost. The anchor was saying he faced enough new federal counts that he'd be relocated to a supermax, that the sun was effectively done with him. It's truly finished, isn't it? Neva asked, her voice barely above a murmur. I nodded and felt something massive shift in my chest, one stone rolling free only for another to settle in beneath it. Bringing down the empire was a victory. But my daughter was still in a hospital bed, somewhere unaware that the thing that had destroyed her life had been dismantled. The darkness had receded from the world, but the light hadn't found its way to the person who needed it most. 30 days of quiet followed the loudest night I'd ever lived through. Recovery doesn't arrive like a switch thrown in a dark room. It's a crawl, slow and grinding through the debris of a life that no longer fits. I stood at the observation window of Cedarbrook Recovery Center, keeping watch over Petra through the glass. Inside, the rhythm of the residential program ticked away steadily, a metronome of scheduled therapy that measured every moment of the distance still between us. She was out in the garden, her hospital ID badge fastened to her sleeve, like an emblem of a self she was fighting to piece back together. I'd seen her in a group session that morning and registered the shift. She wasn't the kidnapping's victim anymore. She was something harder, a survivor of a demolition that had gone all the way down to the psychological foundation. She carried herself with more physical strength than before. But when she spoke to me during the hour they gave us, the voice that came out of her was hollowed clean through. You're looking better, Petit, I offered from the shade at the edge of the garden. There's color in your face again. Color is just light bouncing off a surface, Dad, she said, her eyes staying down. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going on inside. Petra told me she'd been quietly exchanging letters with the FBI, not out of anything resembling feeling for Declan, but to take apart her own trauma with the same cold precision she'd apply to a dissection. Trauma is a structural fire, she said. The flames go out, but you spend the rest of your time walking through a house where the floor could drop beneath you at any step. She told me she'd decided to go back to her surgical residency, limited hours to start. The scalpel doesn't lie to me, she said, her fingers drawing slow shapes in the dirt beside the bench. It obeys physics. Nothing more. The operating room is the only place where things are binary, life or death, open or closed, unlike us. I just want you to have something beyond those hospital walls again, I murmured, feeling the full distance between us sitting in the air. Silence was what we shared now. It was the one thing neither of us had to work at. Neva was out in the car, kept from any direct contact under the early terms of the therapy plan. She'd given me something to carry in, not an explanation, not a tactical handoff, just a small memory she'd been holding since Petra was a child. I breathed in the cut grass and the faint antiseptic threading through the breeze. Your mother still thinks about the blue ribbons from gymnastics, I said. She kept every one of them petty. I expected her to go quiet. Instead, she looked up at me. Does she still have the one from the state finals? The one where the edge frayed? That was the first real fracture in the wall her mind had built. The first sign that the ghost she'd buried was starting to take on the shape of a living person again. I felt a careful flicker of hope move through me, but Petra's next words tilted the ground again. I'll have dinner with her, she said. Under one condition. I don't want the mother who performed for me. I want the agent. I want what's real, not what was rehearsed. She held my eyes with a directness that still had the old Petra inside it. But the question she followed it with told me she wasn't only mending. She was loading up for a different kind of reckoning with our history. Somewhere out in the city, a siren carried on, reminding me that while our particular war had ended, the work of rebuilding was just getting underway. The envelope was heavy, thick, official paper, carrying that particular smell of ink and institutional disinfectant that clings to anything that enters a federal detention facility. It arrived in the Morning Post, a certified document reaching out from the corrections system. I sat at the kitchen table working the stiff paper between my fingers, the crinkle of it dry and deliberate, like turning the page of something that had waited too long to be read. Neva stood at the counter, her eyes following my hands with the quiet, practiced vigilance of someone who never fully stopped being an agent. We went back and forth for an hour about whether to keep it from Petra. If we hide this from her, we're just laying another secret foundation, I said. Looking at the dark ink visible through the translucent paper, I understood concealing the truth was exactly the flaw that had nearly brought our whole family down inside that warehouse. Let her decide whether he still gets a voice in her life. Neva finally came around. I brought the letter to Cedar Brook Recovery Center 5 weeks after the raid, carrying it out to Petra in the garden, like something that needed to be handled with care, her final structural reckoning with the last decade. She sat on a bench beneath the autumn oaks, a wind moving slow and cool through the branches above her. Declan didn't reach for forgiveness anywhere in those pages. What he offered instead was a near-clinical accounting of the directives he'd been handed, remorseful in tone, precise in detail. 3 pages handwritten in a tight, deliberate script, the penmanship of a man with more hours than he knew what to do with. It read, Petra, I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I know I never will. What I can give you is the truth you deserve. I was 8 years old when your mother helped destroy my family. I watched federal agents drag my father away in chains while I sat in the rubble of our home. The boss, the man who raised me after that, told me every day that the Halfords were thieves who stole my birthright. He trained me to see you not as a person, but as a target. For years, I believed him. But then I met you. You were 16, bright and so full of life that it hurt to look at you. The plan was simple. Get close, gain trust, and when the time came, destroy everything. I followed that plan for 11 years. But somewhere in those years, something broke in me. I started to love the lie more than the mission. I loved the way you laughed at my jokes. I loved the way you believed in me when no one else did. I loved being a Halford more than I ever loved being a disciple. The truth is, I wanted out. I wanted to take you and run. But the boss had Owen, my real son, the boy I fathered in my other life. He told me if I didn't finish the job, he'd kill him. So I kept lying, kept playing both sides, hoping I could find a way to save everyone. I failed. I named Owen after your father, Petra, even when I was pretending to hate the Halfords. I couldn't stop respecting the man who showed me what a real father looked like. I hope that tells you something, even if it doesn't change anything. You deserved a real husband. You deserved a real life. I'm sorry I stole that from you, Declan. He disclosed that he'd been on the verge of flipping against the covenant years earlier, but Neva's staged death had persuaded him there was no one left on the right side he could reach. The most staggering detail, though, concerned his life in Indiana. He wrote that his son's name was Conrad. Petra's hands went still against the paper. He named him after you, Dad. Even his betrayals were assembled around a borrowed respect for our family. Ash. That was the whole of an 11-year marriage reduced to residue in her mind. The letter went on to reveal that the primary wife in Indiana was actually another FBI informant Neva had planted years ago, meaning Declan's entire second life had been a closed loop of federal surveillance he never once detected. Petra didn't cry. She asked me if I had a lighter. I watched the paper curl and blacken in the cool air, the smoke rising and taking the last physical trace of Declan Veach with it. She looked at the ash settling across her fingertips with an expression of nauseating clarity. I don't need his apologies, she said, her voice carrying something solid and reclaimed. I need his absence. A name is the most foundational element of any structure, and hers had been bearing weight it was never designed to carry. She turned toward me, the light catching something determined in her eyes. I'm ready to be a Halford again, Dad. One that isn't under surveillance, one that is real. The foundation is finally clear. Patty, I told her, feeling something like triumphant relief move through us both. The infection had been cut out. As the final scrap of the letter crumbled into gray dust and disappeared into the grass, she fixed me with a look that was frank and unguarded, and entirely hers. Now tell me everything about the night you and Mom really met, she said. I understood then that this bridge between us wasn't simply repaired. It was standing on honest ground for the first time. I drew a long breath, ready to tell the story, without any shadows in it, knowing at last that the load-bearing walls of our life could hold what was true. The sunlight landed on the steel cables of the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge with a brilliance I hadn't noticed in years, throwing a latticework of shadows across the water that looked like the map of a journey finally arriving at its end. The smell of slow-smoked brisket and applewood smoke was the first genuinely honest thing to fill our backyard in longer than I could remember. 6 weeks had passed since the warehouse, and the North Carolina air was beginning to release its heavy summer grip. I stood beside the fire pit and watched Neva and Petra together. One by one, my daughter fed the wedding album and every framed photograph of Declan into the flames. She watched the glossy record of a manufactured marriage blacken and curl with a quiet, ceremonial steadiness. It was the removal of a structural parasite that had taken up residence in our home for far too long. For the first time, Neva wasn't reading the perimeter or checking the tree line. Her eyes stayed on her daughter. I'm not burning the memories, Dad, Petra said, her voice carrying a resonance I recognized from a long time ago. I'm burning the lies they were printed on. I nodded and reached out to take her hand. The warmth of her palm was steady and real. It's okay to let it go, Petey Neva said softly. There's finally room for something real. Fire is a strange thing. It can level everything you built, or it can be the only warmth you have while you're starting over. The mood lifted from the burning and settled into something ordinary as I got the grill going, a regular Sunday cookout, nothing more. No encrypted devices on the table, no covert surveillance running in the background, no pretense of a perfect son-in-law. We talked about the small things: Petra's upcoming surgical rotation, my new contract for a suspension bridge in Wilmington. Neva settled into a patio chair, the last orange light of the evening falling across the pine trees and landing on a face that looked younger than it had in years. She told us then that she'd formally handed in her resignation from the bureau, a real retirement. Not the quiet consultant arrangement she'd been maintaining in secret. She told the actual story of how we'd found each other, the librarian cover gone for good. He spilled his coffee all over my surveillance notes, she said, laughing, the sound of ice shifting in her glass, like something I'd missed for a long time. I was sure he was an informant trying to throw me off. Turns out he was just graceless. I wasn't graceless, I said, grinning as I worked the spatula. I was terrified by how beautiful you were. Home. For the first time in longer than I could count, it wasn't a fortified perimeter. It was just home. Petra sat watching us with a settled, clear-eyed peace. She told us she'd set up a trust fund for Declan's son in Indiana, her way of breaking the chain of vengeance through a quiet, deliberate act of grace. As the sun slid under the horizon, I watched my wife and daughter laughing together in the fading light. I thought about suspension bridges. I've spent my career studying how tension is what gives them their strength, provided the anchors go deep enough. We had finally found bedrock. We're solid, Conrad Neva said, resting her head against my shoulder. No cracks. Looking at the two of them, I felt it. The structure was finally sound. I watched the last glowing fragment of the wedding album climb into the dark sky, a tiny orange point of light that dissolved among the real stars. Whatever bridge we raised from here wouldn't merely hold, it would soar. A bridge is a promise rendered in steel, an unspoken agreement between two shores that the distance between them can be crossed without dread. 3 months after the warehouse raid, I was sitting in my engineering office, the weight of a final project ledger in my hands, when Aldrich stopped by for one last unofficial visit. His presence no longer carried the sharp, tactical edge it once had. "He's gone," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the flat finality of a file being closed. The heart gave out in his supermax cell. No more disciples, no more sleeper agents. The architect of the Covenant had died of natural causes. I expected some surge of triumph, a last crashing wave of justice, but what I felt instead was lightness. The ghost who had shadowed my marriage for 30 years had simply faded out with the passage of time. Aldrich mentioned, almost as a footnote, that the Bureau had been providing anonymous support for Declan's son in Indiana. The boy's schooling quietly covered a final act of symmetry for a child pulled from the wreckage in 1994. The Bureau wasn't just shutting down a case, I understood then. It was trying to close a wound. A month later, I brought Neva and Petra to the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge in Wilmington. The salt air hit sharp and clean, a genuine break from the stagnant silt of everything we'd waded through. We stood on the observation deck, the faint tremor of the steel cables traveling up through my feet like a living pulse. Lies are the rust of the soul. Truth is the galvanization that keeps the steel standing long after the storms pass. I walked them through the physics of the suspension system, the massive cables serving as a metaphor for our own endurance. The anchors have to be sunk deeper than the river is dark, I told them, gesturing toward the great concrete foundations buried in the churning water below. That is what we did. We anchored ourselves in the truth. Petra back in her surgical residency, her eyes finally carrying something other than that hollow, guarded distance, gazed out over the water. "I'm ready to stop watching for what's coming up behind me, Dad," she said, her voice holding steady against the wind off the river. Industrial skylines no longer read to her as threats. They looked like roads ahead. Hold on. That was the only instruction I had left to follow. As we moved toward the center of the span, the rhythmic drone of traffic on the bridge deck rose and fell beneath us like a steady pulse. I looked at my wife and understood she was no longer a librarian, no longer an agent, no longer anyone's ghost. She was simply Neva. Neva reached into her coat pocket and produced the old brass key to Unit 24. She'd kept it not as a tool for any mission, but as a keepsake from the day she'd watched her husband become the man she had always believed he was. "No more secrets," I asked the blinding copper of the setting sun stretching our joined shadows long across the bridge surface. "Just the ones we choose to keep for ourselves," she answered, and the smile that came with it reached all the way to her eyes. We were a structure that had survived full collapse and come out the other side stronger for it. I closed my ledger for the last time, marking the Halford family safe for occupation. Looking out over the Atlantic, the horizon open and gilded, and without limit, I realized I wasn't scanning the surface for fractures anymore. I was just taking in the view. Time is the only true structural sealant pressing itself into the broken places until you can stand on them again without flinching. 2 years had passed since the night the shadows finally drew back from our lives, and the stretch of Atlantic I'd once been afraid to face had become my steady horizon. I stood on the back porch of our Charlotte home, both hands resting on the porch rail, something solid beneath my palms, in the amber light of an autumn afternoon. Neva was out in the yard, tending a garden she actually planned to see flower come spring, her eyes no longer cutting toward the exits. When Petra arrived, she looked genuinely alive in a way that wasn't a mask she'd had to put on. 2 years of therapy had gone into carefully rebuilding the trust Declan Veach had systematically stripped away. She told me she'd applied Neva's old investigative methods to run a background check on the man she was bringing over today, then shown him the results as an act of radical, uncompromising honesty. "He's almost here, Dad," she said, leaning into the post beside me. "I promise he's exactly who he says he is. I'm not worried about him, Petty," I told her, smiling as the smell of roasting corn drifted over from the grill. "I'm just glad to see you." A few minutes later, Harmon Quill, a 34-year-old history teacher with ink-stained fingers and a smile that went all the way to his eyes, stepped into our lives, carrying no secrets at all. He was unassuming and visibly nervous, his hands working at the hem of his sweater. Have you ever looked at a complete stranger and felt grateful for just how ordinary and honest and wonderful they were? I ran my own quiet inspection, watching for the tells I'd learned to read, and found nothing but the genuine, slightly awkward sincerity of a man who loved my daughter. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Halford," Harmon said, taking my hand with a grip that was honest and slightly damp. "Petra has told me well, she's told me everything." "Everything is a heavy thing to carry, Harmon," I said, pulling out a chair. "Come sit down." Neva welcomed him with a warmth that had no tactical motive behind it. Laughter rose from the table, the only sound in years we hadn't had to manufacture. We settled in as the sun began its descent, long, quiet shadows stretching across the lawn. The conversation moved without effort. Harmon talked about his students wrestling with the Civil War. Petra described her upcoming chief residency. No encrypted phones sat between the dishes, no undercurrent of surveillance ran beneath the small talk. The Sunday cookout wasn't a cover anymore. It was a family that had come through a complete structural collapse, gathering at the table because they wanted to. "I think the foundation is holding," I murmured, leaning close to Neva. Better than holding Conrad, she said back. It's growing. Harmon reached into his bag and came out with a gift, a bundle of letters from the boy in Indiana. He's doing well, Harmon said, placing the warm weight of a fresh envelope in my hands. He wanted you to know. As I held those pages, I understood that what we'd done hadn't stopped at saving our own family. We had reached across the divide to pull the next generation clear of the old rust. A perfect southern afternoon isn't measured by the absence of heat. It's measured by the people around you who finally have nothing left to conceal. I stood at the grill, the scent of slow-smoked brisket and applewood smoke lifting into the golden North Carolina evening. I felt the warmth of the ceramic plates bleeding through my palms as I carried them to the table, a weight I was glad to hold. The conversation out on the patio bore no resemblance to a tactical briefing or a network of carefully maintained cover stories. Harmon was asking Neva about her actual childhood in Virginia, and she was answering with an ease I hadn't witnessed in years. No mental ledger consulted, no glance toward the gate. I found out over the main course that Harmon had been helping Petra write a memoir about the mother who wasn't there, converting their shared wreckage into something that might light a way out for others still stuck in the dark. I think these are the best ribs you've ever made, Conrad, Petra said, reaching across the table with hands that didn't tremble. No structural failures in this batch. I met her eyes and smiled. That's because I didn't have to keep one eye on the driveway this time, honey. A family is a suspension bridge. The load it carries gives it meaning, but without truth running through the cables, the whole thing snaps. We talked about the latest word from Indiana as the crickets started up in the tall grass. The boy who'd been rescued, the one who could so easily have become another Declan, had just taken first place in a regional science fair. He wants to be a structural engineer, Dad, Petra told me, her eyes carrying a brightness that felt like something reclaimed from the wreckage. I think it runs in the family, even the ones we choose ourselves. I hope he builds things designed to outlast us, I replied, the cool evening air moving against the back of my neck. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the people who had managed to turn a current of inherited hatred back out to sea before it swamped another generation. Nothing was hidden anymore, not even the stars. As twilight settled in and the patio lanterns took over, I stepped back to gather the plates. I paused and looked at the three people who held my whole world together. A house is just an arrangement of wood and stone, a skeleton of design. A home is the integrity of the people living inside it. I caught Neva's eye in the soft amber light. She leaned close and told me she'd finally fed the last of her Unit 24 files into the shredder that morning, walking away from the ghost life without keeping a single backup. It is a good night, Neva, I said, pressing my head to hers. It is the best night, Conrad, she breathed back, because it is just a night. The work was done. The bridge was finished. The anchors held, and the road stretched out clear for miles. I looked up at the first constellations breaking through the North Carolina sky and genuinely felt it. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't standing on a span waiting for it to fail. I was just walking across it. I watched Neva and Petra share a laugh that carried no weight behind it. No performance, no grief, just laughter. The shadows had cleared. The light was here to stay. Forgiveness isn't a single dramatic moment of release. It's the slow settling of the ground after decades of movement beneath the surface. I watched my family from the porch as the evening wind picked up, threading through the pine needles with a clean, sharp smell. Neva moved through the kitchen on the other side of the screen door, her silhouette carrying a looseness she'd never had, during all those years hiding a federal badge behind a library desk. I thought about her decades of deception, not with the serrated sting of betrayal, but with the worn, bone-deep understanding of someone who had survived the same war from a different position. You don't have to explain it anymore, Neva, I murmured as she came out to stand beside me. The wooden door frame was cool and steady under my hand. I can see the bridge you built. I understand now why you kept the cables out of sight. She rested her head against my shoulder, her breath warm against the cooling air. I just wanted you to have a life that was yours, Conrad, she said softly, not theirs. I understood then that her deception hadn't been a failure of trust in me. It had been a sacrificial act of protection. I was finally fully ready to stop carrying as a grievance. I've spent a career inspecting bridges, and I think about what that work was really preparing me for the structural collapse of my own family. A bridge's strength doesn't come from being rigid or sealed off from the world. It comes from absorbing tension and spreading the load without breaking. We were a new design forged in the fires of the warehouse and the funeral. Rust only wins when you stop looking for it. And for 30 years, we had both been looking each in our own way. A bridge is just a way to beat the distance. Love is just a way to beat the dark. In that quiet moment, I admitted something to myself. I had sensed the truth of her other life years before the collapse. I'd noticed the inconsistencies, the way she held a knife, the way her eyes swept a room before the rest of her settled into it. And I had chosen to let the lie stand for the sake of the peace we had. We were both architects of the same deception, building a shelter out of shadows. I looked up at the North Carolina stars and felt the full scale of the world alongside the small, solid thing I had managed to hold on to. The sound of distant cicadas laid a quiet rhythm beneath my thoughts about the boy in Indiana and the inheritance of truth we'd left behind for him. Safe, the most beautiful word in the language. It wasn't a line on a report anymore. It was the very atmosphere of the house I was standing in. I moved back inside the warmth of the kitchen, wrapping around me like something earned. Petra looked up from the table, her gaze clear and unburdened. "Coming in, Dad?" she asked, her voice carrying a brightness that was real and required no effort. I looked at my wife and my daughter, the two anchors of everything I was. "I'm already home," I told her. My final structural report wasn't going to be written about a suspension span or a concrete pier. It was a letter I'd already started drafting to the boy in Indiana, offering him the one thing Declan had never truly been given: a mentor who knows how to construct things that are built to last. I pressed the porch light off with a firm click, left the shadows to the past, and stepped back into the warm and honest light of a house that had finally run out of room for ghosts. The structure was sound. The inspection was over. The silence of the house was total now, a heavy, peaceful stillness that let me sit in my study and listen to the low hum of the desk lamp. If you looked at the people you love right now, really looked, would you recognize the ghosts they're keeping at bay? That question has followed me for 30 years. And sitting here at these keys, I realize that structural integrity has very little to do with steel and concrete. I devoted my entire career to hunting hairline fractures in physical spans, while the truly massive fissures were widening right there in my own living room. That is a dangerous blindness, one I've been setting down in these pages as a guide for Declan's biological son in Indiana. I want that boy to grow up holding a blueprint for integrity, a field manual for spotting the rust before the deck gives way beneath him. I used to believe a bridge was safe because it looked solid. Now I know it's only safe because it has been tested by the full weight of the truth. We all have a Unit 24, a locked room where we store the things we haven't found words for. The task isn't keeping that door shut forever. It's knowing which moment calls for opening it. Forgiveness isn't the absence of pain. It's having enough truth at hand to bear the weight of what's behind you. Are you listening? Because the crack in your own life is rarely located where you've been looking. It tends to hide behind an ordinary face, a domestic routine, a quiet and reassuring smile. What I know now is this: you cannot go back to the shape things held before the collapse. You can only move forward into what they are now. Her greatest mission was never the arrest of a criminal or the dismantling of an empire. It was making certain our family came out the other side of her own identity's wreckage. Trust isn't built on the absence of secrets. It's built on the knowledge that the structure is strong enough to carry them. A story is just a bridge between two people. I hope this one held your weight through the darkest stretch of our crossing. Petra is back in her residency, learning every day that a scalpel can repair just as much as it can cut, provided the hand guiding it is steady. I look down at the cold band of my wedding ring, the very one I wore to a funeral that was never really a funeral, and I accept that even ghosts need somewhere to belong. Safe, the most beautiful word in the language. This Project 143 KV4 was never just a case file. It was my own hidden anchor. The code name itself was a secret I guarded even at my most furious. 143 for I love you and KV4 for Neva's original agent ID. Everything connects to somewhere else, one bridge after another, and I have finally found where I'm meant to stand. I am closing the digital ledger now. The gray evening light coming through the window marks the end of my watch. This is Conrad Halford. Inspection complete. I shut the laptop, the screen going dark and giving back my own reflection, not as a widower and not as a victim, but as a man who had finally learned the difference between a secret and a sanctuary. I closed the laptop, the screen going black and throwing my face back at me, not as a widower and not as a victim, but as a man who finally understood where a secret ends and a sanctuary begins. A story doesn't truly end when the last word lands. It ends when the person who's been listening finally feels steady enough to rise and walk back into their own life. I felt the cool smoothness of the door handle as I pulled myself out of the study, leaving the digital ledger behind for the last time. The living room light pooled out into the hallway, a warm amber wash that felt less like illumination and more like an embrace. I came into the kitchen to find Neva filling 2 wine glasses, the quiet musical sound of the pour a soft punctuation to the stillness of the evening. She caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing wink. The same gesture she'd once deployed to get us both through a dull PTA meeting or a grinding overnight flight. But I understood in that moment it was something deeper than that. That wink was a transmission in a code we had spent 30 years building together. A wordless signal that said, I am finally safe. It was the last confirmation I needed, proof that the agent and the librarian had settled into one thing, a woman who was simply and completely my wife. You look like a man who just finished a very long walk, she said, pressing a glass into my hand. I took a sip and felt the weight of the day begin to release its grip. I think I'm finally home. Neva Petra joined us a moment later, the scent of night-blooming gardenia still on her from the porch. She angled her phone toward us to show a photograph of a bridge design she'd been studying in a medical journal, a piece about how civil engineering shapes access to hospital care. I want to see the Wilmington Project, Dad, she said, her eyes carrying a brightness that had no hidden agenda beneath it. I want to understand how you anchor something built on that scale. We'll go together, I told them. All 3 of us. So what is there to wait for? The light is on, and the road ahead is open. The conversation drifted toward the future, toward vacations that had nothing to do with safe houses and Sundays that required no surveillance sweep beforehand. For the first time, we weren't mapping the exits. We were facing the entrance. A beginning is just an ending that chose to keep moving. I stepped out onto the porch one last time and stood in the steady, rhythmic pulse of the crickets, settling in for the night. The bridge is open. Now it is your turn to cross. Check your own anchors. Search for the rust in your own foundations and never let fear of the truth keep you from what holds the steel together. Good night. I turned back toward the house and noticed a small handwritten sign Petra had tucked into the corner of the porch railing that afternoon. Halford and Company inspection complete. It was a declaration of a new family enterprise, honesty as the operating principle, a blueprint drawn for a life designed to last. The laughter of my wife and daughter came drifting through the open window as the rest of the world went quiet. A sound that clean required no code. The last thing I held in my mind wasn't a secret. It was the clear, unguarded reflection of a man with nothing left to conceal. This concludes the journey. The structure is sound. When I look back across everything that unfolded, I understand now that this was never only a story about crime, betrayal, or endurance. It was a hard mirror held up to my own failures of vision. For decades, I operated on the belief that providing stability and security was the full measure of keeping a family safe. But a man can spend his entire career hunting fractures in steel and concrete and still walk right past the cracks splitting open inside his own walls. That is the lesson that cost the most to learn. The real war was never about bringing Declan down or vindicating myself. It was about pulling my daughter clear of a cycle of hatred that had been running for decades and choosing to end it rather than pass it forward. The true victory had nothing to do with revenge. It was built from choosing truth over the comfort of secrets and choosing the long, difficult work of healing over the short relief of anger. That choice is what altered this family and me permanently. If there is one thing worth carrying away from my mistakes, it is this: do not walk past the quiet warnings the way I did for so long. Pride and silence and the lies we tell ourselves, because they are easier, these things erode the strongest foundations from the inside, invisibly, until the day they don't hold anymore. Love cannot be protected through control. It can only be protected through honesty. In the end, I believe the darkness was allowed to rise precisely so the truth could finally do what it was always capable of doing: set the structure free. This was never a story about punishment. It was always about redemption. When I look at my family now, Neva in the yard, Petra back at work with steady hands and clear eyes, I understand that the bridge held. Not because it was perfect, because it was true. The last thing I saw before sleep took me wasn't a threat or a shadow or a case file waiting to be opened. It was the honest, unguarded face of a man who had finally run out of things to hide. The structure is sound. The inspection is over. If you've stayed with me through all of it, the empty coffin, the brass key, the warehouse, the letter from a prison cell, then you already know this was never a simple story. It was a reckoning. I've thought a long time about what this family paid for the truth. Conrad buried his wife and kept breathing. Neva spent 20 years in the dark, so the people she loved could one day stand in the light. Petra rebuilt herself from the inside out, one honest piece at a time. None of it was clean. None of it was fast. I believe God allowed the darkness to run as deep as it did precisely because what grew out of it needed roots that strong. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be these. Do not confuse a quiet house with a safe one. The cracks in a family rarely announce themselves. When someone you trust shows you a seam that doesn't quite line up, look closer. Loyalty without honesty is just a longer way of lying. Protecting the people you love sometimes means telling them the hard thing, not the comfortable one. And if you ever find yourself at the bottom of something that feels unsurvivable, hold on. Truth has a way of catching up to the dark, given enough time. These are the kinds of father stories I come back to again and again, not because they are easy, but because they are real in the ways that matter. This is a story about family justice, not the courthouse kind, but the kind that happens when people finally stop lying to each other and choose at great cost to rebuild. If it moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, I genuinely read them, and your perspective on this one matters to me. And if you haven't yet, come back for the next story by subscribing to Alpha Dad Stories. Thank you for listening. Take good care of the people who are counting on you.